all for being here. Thanks to the New Mexico Coalition for having me here and for creating this event, this great opportunity. I look at the program and I see old friends, colleagues, amazing experts and leaders in the field, and I hope that people are enjoying the program so far and will enjoy tomorrow's day as well. And I know you will. I am with you through a lot of the afternoon in three sessions. So we're gonna be in this session, hop out of this one, show up in another room. It's like a port key in Harry Potter. We're all in the same place, but we get pulled to another direction. So we'll be moving from this one. I'll be in the next session, and then the third session this afternoon will be myself and panelists. And so just know that if it's a little confusing, that I'll kind of remind people at the end, or Terry or Lisa remind you at the end that you're leaving here and going to join me in another room afterwards. So kind of previewing this, for you now, just to know that that's happening. I'm going to do my best in an hour to really talk you through the Safe It Together model, which some of you are familiar, some of you aren't, but you might want that as a backdrop to really talking about the work here in New Mexico, and really to talk about the Kickstarter collaboration, which is kind of the main purpose ultimately about why I'm here, is to talk about this great collaboration funded by CYFD, funded by Child Protection here in New Mexico, who's been a great partner with us for a number of years at this point, to really improve collaboration between pilot in New Mexico, collaboration improvements between CYFD staff and La Casa, a domestic violence agency in Doña Ana County. And so I'm really excited about that the main part of that project's wrapping up. I'll talk about what we think some of the outcomes are a little bit, but we're doing some formal evaluation, and that will be coming kind of later on this year. But I will kind of give you the backdrop on this session on the model. I'll talk in the next session about the Kickstarter project and also our wider work on collaborations between child protection and advocates. And then the third session will be the panel. So that's the way it's going to go. I would love it, because I'm jumping in here in the middle. If people want to use the chat box to just indicate where you're joining from and what kind of work you do, and it'll give me a chance to kind of scan the chat box and learn a little bit about the audience, and so it just would be useful for me. I will be trying to stop and do questions and answers at some point, and if you want to drop things along the way into the chat box, that will help. And Lisa, if you can kind of keep track of that and let me know if there's a question there that I might miss, that would be great. And either I'll stop at the end a few minutes early or try to stop at a couple of points along the way. I just want to do a shout out to the team, Teresa, David, and those who really organized this great event. I want to do a shout out to our kind of key partners at CYFD, who's really been funding a lot of our work in New Mexico, and that being David River and Delphine Trujillo particularly. And really it was actually David's idea to do the Kickstarter project, so he's the one who asked us if we could do that. So it was a great collaboration in kind of conceiving this and doing that work. And so I just want to kind of start with that. I also just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you and in many ways all of us are on colonized and settled land, and that where I'm joining you from in Connecticut, the traditional custodians of land are the Tungus people, part of the larger Algonquin nation, and that colonization isn't just historic, it's ongoing. It's in the history of broken treaties, it's in the differential response, kind of the way tribal nations, First Nation people experience COVID. It's here in so many different ways, and it's so important for us to acknowledge and work with that history and the history of structural racism in the United States as well. And just want to acknowledge any Indigenous elders, past, present, or emerging, who are with us today. It's an important part of our commitment. We start most of our meetings this way, and it's really, I had to be introduced to this tradition, unfortunately, from in Australia, not in the United States, and really that acknowledgement of country has become an important part of how we acknowledge some of these major issues that are present in the United States and other places we're working where there's history of colonization, for instance. So thank you for dropping in the chat, where you're from, the kind of work you're doing, wanted to see who is here beyond New Mexico. And hi to Olga. I haven't seen you in a while. I got, folks from Maine. We've got some of our certified trainers on here. I see Sarah Hughes are on here. Great to see you here. So anyway, it's great. Who's joining us from Michigan, folks from Virginia. So just, wonderful to drop this stuff into the chat and really kind of really see who's present. I'm gonna, start and give people who might not know the Institute a little bit of introduction, and then jump into the model and some of its implications. And I'd like to invite people really, as they're listening, to think about their own practice, or think about, if you're a policymaker, think about your own policy. And for me, as a former practitioner, none of this is theoretical. This is all about what we do and how we act. The model itself is very behavioral in its focus, and it's behavioral at a number of different levels. It's behavioral at the level of perpetrators' patterns of behavior. It's behavioral at the level of identifying survivors' protective capacities, but it's also behavioral at the level of the practitioner. How do we do what we do? Not what do we do, but how do we do it? How do we screen? How do we interview? How do we assess? How do we document? How do we talk to one another? And one of the things that will run through this session into the Kickstarter overview and also into the panel is the way it's become emergent that the Safe and Together model as a systems change approach, which is what it is giving people a common language and a common framework to talk about issues of domestic violence in children, cross-sector, cross-team, intra-agency, inter-agency, and do it in a way that really works, whether you're a DV agency doing work with victims or perpetrators, or you're a child protection agency. We're seeing it being worked and used in high-risk teams across the globe. We're seeing it, for instance, in a multi-agency triage team in Australia, in northern Melbourne. They use the Safe and Together model's critical components to guide their review of police referrals to statutory child protection. And they found that using that, they could divert 90% of those cases almost to the community sector, keeping families that had often been pulled into, child protection systems out of those systems, but still receiving services. And that was very much on the back of the Safe and Together model's ability to bring people together. Working in Ohio, we would hear both for over 10 years, working with child protection and with advocates, we'd hear, we trust each other more. We have more confidence in each other. We can be on a panel together without fighting, is what one person said. And so I'm going to talk to you about that. So I really want you thinking about, what does this mean at the level of practice and level of behavior change for practitioners? And if you're a supervisor or a manager, or you're a leader of an organization, really think about how does this show up or not show up in the work that you do. So let me pull up my PowerPoint and start from the beginning. And and so right with the title, we're starting with this idea that how do we link together domestic violence perpetration with children? Because a lot of times people struggle to make that connection. They wonder where the nexus is or the connection is, especially if the kids are pre-verbal, they didn't see it. We know it's harmful, we're worried about the harm, but we often have trouble languaging and articulating it. So one of the ways we talk about it here at the Safe Together Institute is this idea that domestic violence perpetration is a parenting choice. And how do we shine the lens of of a behavioral pattern on perpetrators and connect their behaviors to harm they're creating for children. I'm going to kind of dive into that a little bit more. In the subtitle, How to Stop Blaming Mothers, Ignoring Fathers, and Fix the Way We Keep Children Safe from Domestic Violence. Really, one of the things I want to say at the outset, before I go any further, that the Safe It Together model, its behavioral focus, is on one level objective and impartial, right? That it's behavioral and it will work across any scenario: men's use of violence against women, women's use of violence against men, violence in same-sex relationships, violence in trans relationships. That the model and its pattern-based approach was designed from its outset about 15 years ago to really look at the facts on the ground in this family and not prejudge. At the same time, the model is also gender responsive. We have a whole paper about this paradox of the Safe It Together model off our website. But the paradox that we really need to also at the same time, it's negligent and impossible to leave out gender in our understanding. And what I mean by that is, while both men and women can be violent, both men and women can be controlling, that men's violence is more likely to be tied to a pattern of coercive control. And it's more likely to create injury and harm in a female victim, which is a good proxy for control. So those are two of the differences. The third difference is that, and this is the one I want to emphasize, really kind of looking at it here, is that very differing expectations of mothers and fathers makes it impossible to use generic language. And what I would offer to you is that that we have much higher expectations of mothers than we do of fathers as parents, men more of women than we do of men as parents. And this shows up in so many different ways in practice and language, from referring to fathers babysitting their own children to always asking the mothers if the kids are medically up to date. And I go through this when I do live training. I go through and ask people, if you've got a question about whether the kids are medically up to date, who do you go to, mothers or fathers? And almost the chorus is almost mothers. And if you got an issue at parent-teacher conference, or the house is dirty, who do you think is responsible? Again, the resounding voice is mothers. And so what that means is that we have to really reflect on how biases around gender, double standards around gender expectations, actually is an impediment to impartiality. And it's an impediment to being objective, because that behavioral approach really says, let's look at the behaviors and really understand the impact. It also interferes with our ability to identify mothers who are protective, the full range of their strengths. And I'm going to go into that more. But so much of the Safe It Together model is about giving systems the language and the tools to move away from failure to protect as a paradigm, and really replace it with what we refer to as a domestic violence-informed perpetrator pattern-based approach. And this is what, as I kind of go through this is what has been adopted around the globe very recently, and I keep saying this because I don't really quite believe it. We train our core training. In New Mexico, they do this with certified trainers. CYFD this does in certified trainers, and I gave a shout out to Sarah Huser. She's one of our faculty. She trains the trainers. She's really amazing. That we, through our certified trainer program, our partner agency program, we have about 280 certified trainers around the globe, almost 80 partner agencies. And through those partner agencies, through our online portal, through our own training through faculty, in 2021, almost 4,500 people, over 4,000 people, professionals, received training in our 4-day core training. That's just one of the trainings we offer, online or in person or through our partner agencies. And that amounted to around 90,000 hours of training for just the core training, which is just part of what we do, in just 2021. And so when you I'm giving this to you kind of up front, so when you think about this, you can think about really the uptake of the model, and it's being rolled out in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. And the United States through a lot of cases, agencies like CYFD, agencies like La Casa here. So real quick, if you're not familiar with us, this is our mission. Trying to give you a sense of that this network that's talked about here is not aspirational. It's real. It's growing. It's ongoing. Every year we add about maybe 60 to 80 new certified trainers to the network, a number of partner agencies, and every place we go, we're really trying to give the same message around systems change and how to kind of create communities, professionals, and systems that are more sensitive to the needs of survivors, adult and child, know how to partner with survivors, and know how to intervene with perpetrators as parents. And, again, I encourage you to go to our website, which is just about to be revamped, and there's multiple different ways you can kind of connect to us, some via training, some via online learning, some via free webinars or podcasts like Partner with a Survivor. If you're interested in the e-learning, you can go to academy.safeittogether.com. So there's just tons of things we do, and that number at the bottom of the slide is old. I'm guessing based on the changes that happened over the last few years that number may be closer to 100,000 kids that are reached through professionals. And so we're really working to change the way professionals practice and through them really outcomes for domestic violence survivors, for families, and for communities. For those of you who are a little more visually oriented, this is some of the areas we've been working more recently. Of particular interest, obviously, we'll be focusing on New Mexico, but we've had multi-year engagement with Michigan, which again, I'm going to keep shouting out to you, which Sarah was instrumental. One person, Sarah came to our conference over 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago, and then went back and advocated for Safe It Together and promoted it. And now we're, supporting co-located advocate. They're training across the state. We've had major pushes for statewide training. They've got a number of certified trainers. So I love telling Sarah's story because it really is about the power of one person to promote change and advocate and pick up the model and run with it and really appreciated Sarah's work. But we're working with the Ministry of Defense in the United Kingdom, where their Army Welfare Services is training the model. And what they're telling us, for instance, is it's helping them prevent separation, discharge of survivors, where prior to that, they would have looked at the performance of a survivor who was a service person and seen that performance degrading. And then they would have discharged them eventually. And they say this is not a one-off. They're able to come in, identify that they're being abused, pivot to the perpetrator, support and partner the survivor, and actually focus on interventions, whether it's discharge or disciplinary action against the perpetrator. And one story they told me was somebody who was bound to be discharged. When they kind of responded this way, she then kind of moved into a position where she could be promoted. So not only did it stop her from being discharged, but it really actually allowed her to flourish in her role in the military. Of other particular interests, we're working in collaboration with Women's Aid, Scottish Women's Aid in Scotland. We're partnering with the Domestic Abuse Commissioner in England and Wales. So there's just lots of different relationships that we are working on, whether it's our work with partnership with Department of Youth Services in Iowa or work with a local court in Nebraska. Just again, our engagements with systems really varies all over the world. What I will highlight in the work with Australia is the Family Court of Australia. And very different than the United States, but more similar to the United Kingdom. Family court is nationalized in Australia for all intents and purposes. There's only one state that's not covered. And so over a year and a half ago, they engaged us to come in and do training for judges, training for their registrars, who are their legal case managers, their lawyer case managers, and then their court child experts who provide the evaluation services to the court in Australia. And through that, through input, we've given guys them changing their screening tool, their practice direction to their evaluators. We've done coaching with those evaluators at time, and now we're about to work with them about alternative dispute resolution. That we're starting to see feedback from them saying survivors are going into court and meeting with evaluators and breaking down crying because they're getting validated for the first time. We're getting court orders being recommended by the evaluators to judges to order what's called sole responsibility, which is sole legal custody, so that survivors will not have to deal with negotiating with perpetrators around decisions related to the kids. So they may allow contact, supervised or unsupervised, but they're sort of saying, well, this is an issue of coercive control, then we're going to need to kind of reduce the opportunity for that other party to control or interfere with or use the kids. So they're recommending sole legal custody, sole responsibility for that protective parent. So the model in that context has really taken off and really supported a practice change in significant ways. The other that might be interesting is sort of recent project with the Ministry of Health in New South Wales, which is they explained to me is the larger employer in the Southern Hemisphere, which kind of blows me away. And we were working on a research project where we're looking at the intersection of mental health practice, addiction practice, and domestic violence. And it was a multi-year project, which the results should be coming out soon, looking at how do you improve practice. And practitioners came back to us and told us stories like this one practitioner did, which is she was doing mental health counseling to this mother and child, and identified that domestic violence had happened when the mother and the father were married or together as a couple. And she said she would have thought about this as historic, but she, using our mapping tool, mapped the perpetrator's patterns over the relationship in the 7 years post-separation, and identified intensive patterns of the perpetrator's manipulation and targeting of systems and tremendous post-separation coercive control. And this was a family that was involved both in child protection and in family law court. And the perpetrator was making threats against practitioners, like extreme ones, like, I'm going to accuse your spouse of being a child sexual abuser if you don't do what I want. Really tremendous targeting. And so this practitioner really picked up the model, picked up the idea that this person was not safe from the abuse, and labeled it, identified it, and then advocated for her in with child protection, and eventually with the law court, and helped this mother keep her kids safe. She said, when I got involved, the perpetrator had been wearing away at the systems where they started to change their opinion from being an ally or a partner with mom because she was a protective parent to starting to see her as a problem. And she said that allowed me, the model allowed me to really change the way I talked to them, convince them that what they were seeing actually was somebody who was not helping, but actually trying to manipulate systems, trying to hurt the mom, trying to hurt the child, and so was able to really bring those two systems back to where they were originally, which was being in partnership with this protective parent. So really, from my view, the stuff that really gets me up in the morning, stuff that really helps me kind of see what we're doing and really what the mission is around the work. We focus a lot on competencies and tools and cross-system collaboration. So when we get to talk more about the Kickstarter project, you're going to see the role the tools played, some of those tools listed there in the middle. You're going to see how we focused on practice, not theoretical training, not just telling people how bad domestic violence is for kids. Because one of the things that I believe happens is if you teach people who are child-centered how bad domestic violence is for kids, especially if you use the language of children exposed or child witness to domestic violence, which makes the perpetrator's responsibility invisible, right? You get child witness to domestic violence, children exposed to domestic violence, doesn't name the person engaging in the actions. And it also limits you to this concept of, did the kids see it or hear it, language of witnessing, to think about the wider ways perpetrators harm kids. Is that by doing that, by focusing on those things, we gave both child welfare and La Casa, CYFD and La Casa, some of the tools they could have to change their practice, not just sort of understand the harm, but really figure out what to do, how to operationalize accountability for perpetrators, how to partner with survivors. So it was really very foundational in terms of what we did. So we really, again, we're looking at not just developing knowledge, but actually really focusing on skill and competency development and using this shared framework that can help with collaboration. Okay. So, just to kind of bring us down to the level of practice, just a couple of examples. One of the foundations of domestic violence informed practice, or a perpetrator pattern-based approach, is really this ability to talk about the perpetrator's behaviors being the source of the harm to child, partner, and family functioning, to not mutualize the situation, to not locate the relationship as the source of danger to the kids, right? Because if you think the relationship is the source of danger, you think, oh, separation makes the kids automatically safe, which we know isn't automatically true. But really, it's thinking about how much time we spend focusing on survivors' decision making, survivors' choices, and this is really when we think about the dominant paradigm, which has been failure to protect in the child welfare space, has been really suggests that it's the victim parent's choices that we should pay the most attention to, and that she's the most responsible. And we see that played out in places where domestic violence survivors get longer criminal sentences when their partner commits an act of physical maltreatment against their child, for instance. You've seen that actually perpetrator of the crime getting a lower sentence and the victim parent getting a higher sentence, even based on just this idea of failing to protect. And even when it's known that she's a domestic violence survivor. So here's a common dialogue. With the worker saying she's a trauma survivor. This is why she keeps making poor choices. So this is the one of my current things I think about, which is that while trauma-informed work is really important and really identifying trauma as an impact is really important, that through the way we think about it, it's gotten funneled sometimes into this idea of a deficit approach to survivors. I think in the best way, it's non-judgmental, it's compassionate, it's about thinking about, how do we treat symptoms like anxiety or depression. I think there's so much good work around trauma. And when trauma gets used in this way as an explanation for why somebody's been abused multiple times, what does her trauma history have to do with her experience of being abused? Well, she clearly has a problem with her picker. And you can say this a ton of different ways. She makes poor choices. She doesn't know any better. Her trauma's normalized this. You could say this in 10 different ways, but the point is all the same, which is somehow there's some deficit in her, but the implication is, and sometimes it's really stated, which is that somehow that her trauma history and her being a serial victim is the cause of what happened to her, versus each of those partners made their own choice to be violent to her. And this is where you kind of really lean into the rigor of sort of the source of the harm to children from domestic violence is the domestic violence perpetrator's pattern behaviors, the choices they're making, and then from that, the harm that creates for the child, partner, and family functioning. And if instead you're starting a conversation with, well, I've got a mom who's got a long trauma history, and that's the presentation. So again, we're talking about our behavior as practitioners. Then what we're going to get everybody in the room focusing on is her trauma history. If we start with a presentation saying we've got a case where a boyfriend, a dad, the father of the youngest kid, he's got a history of violence and pattern of abuse that looks like this, and this is the harm their behavior has created, this person's created for the children and the family, we're going to go in a completely different direction. And so it's that's the foundation of this, that's the approach. And there are lots of different ways we can get thrown off track, and I'm giving you kind of two examples that are about sort of the intersections of attempts to help survivors, adult and child survivors, or framing the issues around the survivor, and then sort of how those things can inadvertently, not on purpose, but consistently get in the way of holding perpetrators accountable and focusing on them as the source. And so, here, again, these are based on real examples, real case examples. They're composites with a little bit of facts changed or not filled in. She and her son become non-compliant with recommendation to go to counseling. What's changed in her life recently? Her partner's abusive, just moved back in. Didn't he stop them from going to counseling before? Yes. So maybe she didn't become non-compliant. Maybe he's interfering with them going to counseling. And this is based on one particular real story where exactly this happened. The father didn't want the child to go to counseling. Child didn't go to counseling. Father's out of the house. Mom and child go to counseling. Dad moves back in. Within 2 weeks, the counseling stops. But what the note said in the file is mother and child actually had become non-compliant with counseling. And in that moment, any curiosity about or kind of assessment or theory that maybe it was the father who actually interfered or made it unsafe for the counseling to happen, that's gone. And so how do you hold him accountable? And now what has likely been his interference with his son's mental health, his interference with his partner getting support, his continuing abuse is now not the problem. The problem is her noncompliance. And we really want to fundamentally shift the paradigm to this perpetrator pattern-based approach without losing ground on child safety, in fact, gaining ground. That's the whole purpose around the model. and one is this kind of framework in this approach which says domestic violence perpetration is a parenting choice. And it's one way we try to language this idea, and there's more ways we kind of build it into the model, but this idea that it isn't just kids seeing or hearing it that's the problem, but it's the eviction that the perpetrator creates through his violence. It's the consistent violence that causes him to lose his job, that forces the family to move. It's the forcing the family to flee to shelter, unfamiliar environment, even though it may offer relative safety, that it really is this idea of, that the perpetrator is responsible for forcing the other parent to choose between staying in their own home, staying in a familiar environment, keeping the kids going to the same school, keeping the kids down the street from her mother so the mother can watch the kids, keeping them near where she can have a job, and forcing them to flee into an environment which is unfamiliar, maybe anxiety or fear producing, maybe miles, hours away from their familiar environment. All these different things is being forced on the family by the perpetrator's choices. And so for us as a professional to see that clearly and to operationalize it, to talk about it, to explore it, to ask questions, is so critical to doing good domestic violence informed work. And so again, I really want, I'm going to linger here for a moment, but really this idea that that a perpetrator pattern-based approach has to be tied into functioning, whether it's the function of the family or the survivor, the adult protective parent, or the children. And one of the simplest ways to ask this is, how did the perpetrator's behavior change the day-to-day life of this family, or the day-to-day life of this child, or the day-to-day life of this protective parent? What's different now because they engage in these behaviors? And it's a great way to connect the dots. And I'll give you an example. One case that I was involved with on one of the research projects in Australia, they described, the caseworkers we were consulting with described a father who did meth, was a meth addict, and how he took the kids from the home, went to an undisclosed location, called up mom and said, if you don't give me money for drugs, you're never gonna see the kids again. And he left the threat open-ended, right? It wasn't clear it was kidnapping. It wasn't clear that it was murder. But obviously, she was terrorized. She was terrorized. The kids were terrorized, and that was the threat. And remember, again, people often think about the connections between mental addiction and domestic violence as, he was using. But this is another one of those connections, which is actually using the violence and the control, the threat of violence, as a way to get money. So the short part of the story is the kids were returned to his parents safely. They weren't physically harmed. But remember, it's likely that he might not have faced arrest for this, by the way. With that kind of vague statement, he's the biological parent, he's the legal guardian, he had a right to have them with us. But I want you to think about the rolling implications in the family functioning, or the functioning of this parent, for the mother in this case, for a second, just to really get a picture, which is, if this was you, and your partner demonstrate their ability to use the kids in this instrumental way, weaponize the kids, put them in danger, threaten to harm them, threaten to keep them from you, how would it change your day-to-day existence? What different choices would you make? Well, we don't know, but you might not want to let the kids out of your sight. You may not want him to watch the kids when you're around, when you're not around. So that might mean you don't go to work if you don't have childcare. It might mean that you take the kids with you places you don't want to take them to or you wouldn't normally. It means lying to people about why their father's not watching the kids. It may mean, doing things that will make people label you as enmeshed or codependent with the kids. All of a sudden, now you're the problem because you're smothering the kids or you're enmeshed with them. And so all of a sudden, when we decontextualize that survivor's behavior from the perpetrator's pattern, when we decontextualize the survivor's behavior from the perpetrator's pattern, we're more likely to misidentify her behaviors and not see them as protective, not see them as resistance, and actually see them as a problem, as a deficit, or as a pathology. So in this case, the danger would be decontextualizing this mother's response that would be normal, healthy human. I'm going to protect these kids. I'm going to keep them close. He terrified me. I don't trust he's not going to do it again. All very rational things to think. And all of a sudden the danger becomes, one is we'd have to recognize how much harder she's working on a day in and day out basis, right? How hard she's working. That's so critical. We also, how her life has become more complicated and may impact the things that she can do, including working or other things. And so that may be a family functioning piece. And then what does it mean for the kids who might have been terrorized, who also may be clingy, not want to leave their mother? So when we have these examples, when we start asking the questions, don't ask the question, what did the kids see or hear? But ask the question, how did this incident of violence change the kid's life? What's different now? What was different right afterwards? What did they miss? Did they miss school? Did they go outside or did they walk down the road with their younger sibling seeking help? It's really about moving out of this sort of psychology-dominated framework where we often ask how the kids feel, what are they feeling, an internal world, but really adding to that this kind of external world of functioning and really bringing this together to kind of further really understand that kids don't need to be in the room to be impacted by a perpetrator's behavior, but that we need to be able to tell the story and explore those changes to functioning the perpetrator's behavior has created. So this is really foundational to the model. And there's so much I could go into. We've got about another 20 minutes, and I want to really talk about take some questions in a few minutes. But really, for you to see, this is the model's principles, and again, these are all things that are going to come back up as we talk about the Kickstarter project. But partnering with the non-offending parent, is really critical. And the example I always give of this is how do we introduce why we're there for child protection? Do we say we're here because you and your partner got into a fight, or we say we're here because your partner assaulted you last night or was alleged to assault you in front of the kids, and we're concerned for your safety, the safety of the kids, and we want to work with him because if he's engaged in those behaviors of his are harmful for the children. Who would you want to disclose to? A worker who said that, or who says, well, we're here because you and your partner got into a fight? Which person are you more likely to share with? And this is why this is more efficient, more effective, more child-centered, and really why we want to work to build bridges between, and again, this will come out in the Kickstarter panel, I think, which is with a shared interest of child protection and advocates and survivors, is we want the violence to stop and we want things to be good for the kids. And this concept of partnering really allows this to move forward. And again, I want you to think about if you're not in child protection, but you're thinking about if your child protection agency adopted these principles for practice, how you're in a DV agency, how good you'd feel about that, and what it means to you. And we hear a lot over and over again when child protection picks up the model that their DV partners in the community are really excited because they really expect to see a philosophical and practice change that's more consistent with the work that advocates do and that they want to see done with families. We also based the model on these 5 critical components. And this is about assessment and um, um, information gathering and making sure that you're focusing on the right things. And so um, the first 2 boxes at 12 and let's say 2 o'clock is about the perpetrator's pattern. You can see it's not just about physical violence, but it's also about coercive control, these wider patterns of behaviors that are about entrapment and control. And then also including in things like physical abuse of kids, sexual abuse of kids, emotional abuse of kids, using the kids as weapons against the other parent, as I just talked about, interfering with the other parent's relationship with their kids, and really trying to bring together in that perpetrator pattern-based approach, not just his behavior towards this partner, but his behavior towards his kids, behavior towards past partners, behavior toward kids and other relationships, and behavior that is relevant outside the house, like a history of violence, road rage, gang involvement, violence to strangers, violence to professionals. That is all part of really moving into alignment with the lived experience of the family, because if she knows he's a tracker for a gang, again, a real case, that doesn't matter that wasn't actively directed at her. She knows that's part of his capacity. If he's a bouncer at a bar and she's seen him beat the crap out of people at his bar, again, true story, then he might not need to hit her. So if we want to be in alignment with the lived experience of survivors, we need to be thinking much more broadly than physical incidents of violence that happened with her. The survivor who said to me, I don't want to call probation on him because I saw what he did to his last partner when she called and he went to jail. She was very tuned in to his pattern across relationships, not just what he did to her. So when we look in a really narrow lens of behaviors, or just look at the incidents of violence with this person, we often have a very incomplete picture of what's going on. And really particularly as we look at the entrapment. So you have here these critical pieces of information that we want to gather, we want to look at, we want to make sure we know things about, and our training and our work models are really designed about that. And so one of the things that both La Casa and CYFD staff got as part of this, they got our mapping tool, which is an really expanded version of these critical components, and including other things around perpetrators' manipulation of systems, worker safety, and so they both got that tool as part of their toolkit in that Kickstarter project. This is a great way, and this is something we actually have an entire course in our virtual academy on this. We have it as part of our core training, and everybody in the Kickstarter project got access to a lot of the e-learning that we have as part of the program. But here, a lot of things come together and get operationalized. So think about this as a comprehensive assessment framework, and think about, in the upper left-hand corner is the perpetrator's pattern of behavior. In the bottom right-hand corner is what that means for kids. And then in the other 3 areas, you have pathways to getting to the harm to the kids. And what you see here is where a lot of us have been taught to focus on is that children's trauma and safety, which is so important. I don't want to minimize this. But we have to acknowledge it's an incomplete map to child harm. And so we could be adding in addition to what's there, children's, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. But then we go beyond that, we can think about, loss of income. These are all the different ways through their behavior that perpetrators make the kid's life smaller, create an environment possibly of neglect, create an environment of instability, interfere with kids having a safe and nurturing environment, a stable environment. Similarly on the other side, if they're making their partners, or the other parents, depressed, anxious, we know that survivors engage in substance abuse at higher rates than other people. So if we see that that's a result of the abuse, loss of authority, lack of ability to control the kids, and just interference with day-to-day routine and basic care that a perpetrator may cause, when do they interfere with homework being done? When do they interfere with a trip to a special school trip? I remember working with a survivor, and I was working with her partner. She said, I'm going to do anything I can this Christmas, it was Christmas or Easter, to placate him because he's ruined every holiday of the kids' lives. And so I'm going to make sure that I do everything I can to appease him so the kids can have some good memories of their childhood and holidays. And that's an example. That's not day to day or basic care, but that's interference on the perpetrator's part of just so the kids' needs being met or on a psychological basis. So there's more, and I'm going to pick up some of this in the next session, and that's why it's not formally there. I have more of this information than I do the material around Kickstarter. But I want to point you to that. I'm going to talk a little about protective capacities, perpetrator manipulation of systems, intersections with mental health in the next session when we leave this. But I really wanted to take a few minutes and see if there are questions or comments, and that you can drop in the chat, or you can, I don't know, Lisa, if you want, I'm going to stop the share here and just see if people want to raise their hand, unmute, and do a little bit of, I know we've got a lot of people for that, 115, but let's give it a try to see if there's brave souls who want to raise their hand and ask a question.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, feel free to type it in the chat. David Garvin did say that he still remembers hearing this from one of your first time at your conferences. Domestic violence perpetration is a parenting choice. It remains one of the most powerful sentences he's ever heard.
Thanks, David. And then David presented at our conference in Seattle a number of years ago. And it was great to have you there, David. Other questions, comments, things you want me to expand on, or comments about application of this, let me know. This is a window of about 10 minutes before we have to jump off this and be together if you're going to come with it in this other space. Questions, comments, thoughts about how it applies to your work, questions about how it applies to your work, anything that just seems to come to the top of your mind. Again, if you're brave, you can unmute. If you're shy, you can type the question in the chat box. And yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I'll pop in there. Everything you're saying is really hitting home for me, especially with dealing with OCS and with the victims and ICWA, how much the women are seen as the failure to protect, and that's used against them when they have, if they don't take out a protective order, that's considered a failure to protect. Right. If they don't call the police, then that's a failure to protect. If they allow the person back into the home who's paying the bills and is paying the rent, then that is a failure to protect. And it is very, almost all the time, held against the victim for those behaviors. So what you're saying is really hitting home for me.
Thanks, Julie. And what two things I can say about it. One is, that's not any different, in Australia or New Zealand or Canada or the United Kingdom. We see this all over the world, and so much of it hinges on the definition of what professionals think is appropriate behavior for survivors to be protective. It's all about the professional opinion about what she's supposed to do to be protected. Because none of this is written down in law, by the way. You're not going to find anywhere those things that you described, as far as I know, written down in law. It's just what people think she should be doing. She should be going to shelters. She should be calling the police. And this really works doubly against marginalized women, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color in the United States who might be afraid of calling mainstream services. If your community has a history of kids being taken away, then you may be afraid about calling anybody in any service because you don't want that to get back to child protection. You don't want, if you've got a history in the community of victims being arrested, then again, I'm not going to call. And then, it's a double whammy because I don't feel safe enough culturally to call those services. And now if child protection gets involved, I get told I wasn't protective because I didn't call the services. And so part of what we're trying to do is really, and you'll see in the next session, I'll talk about this, is that this is a two-part, this kind of key parts of the model, but two big parts is this idea that you need to do this pivot to the perpetrator that I've been talking about. And then you need to get better at seeing survivors' protective efforts and naming them and validating them and understanding all the ways that she's actively protecting, even when she isn't calling the police, even when she isn't getting or applying for an order of protection, even when she's not going to shelter, that there are often numerous things she's doing to try to manage the situation, work hard. And we as professionals need to name those things, validate them, and then collaboratively partner with them around planning for what next. How can we help you be safer, make this situation better? So anyway, Julie, thanks for sharing your reaction. A couple of other people, Pat Acosta, go ahead.
Hi, David. What I remember the best and the most is attending some of your trainings about 3 years ago. And one of the things that rings the bell, and I think it's important when we speak about collaboration, especially with child protective services, one of the things that we would hear a lot from victims was, I feel that even though I'm the victim, I feel re-victimized when I'm told if I don't leave him, my children are going to be removed. And I think in your program, that was one of the biggest things that I learned. And so when we would often get people referred, a lot of the times they were saying, well, can you meet with both of them to determine who's a primary offender? But I think I always came back to distinguishing and speaking, you got to keep the offender responsible, because oftentimes victims feel that no one really understands them. And that even Child Protective Services looks at them as, well, you're as bad as him because you stay not understanding the dynamics of what they're going through. So I will forever learn the things that I've learned from your program and apply them everywhere I go, because I think it's crucial. And so for that, I thank you, David.
Thank you, Pat. That's wonderful for you saying that. And thank you for the kind words. Two things I want to say off of that, if I can remember both the things. One is I really, want to acknowledge that child protection is one of the hardest jobs in our communities and have a level of responsibility that is unique, in the sense of they've got legal responsibility for kids. They got to sign their name to a piece of paper saying those kids are safe in their home tonight. We all care about kids, but there's something special that comes with that responsibility. And it's anxiety, real questions about risk tolerance. And so that's part one. I just always want to acknowledge that. Part two is I don't think we're preparing inside child welfare or in broader human service community, we're not preparing our practitioners to work with violent fathers, period. We're not expecting them to do it. We're not preparing them to do it. And so what happens is when they're confronted with trying to keep kids safe in a home where there's domestic violence, that the easiest comfortable pathway is focus on the mother. I can do my job if I get her leave. I can do my job. I can achieve my mission if I educate her, if I support her, if I threaten her. That if I can get her out, then we've been successful keeping the kids safe. Even though, and that's often been the framework, leave-in equals safety, when we know that it's more complicated than that. And so part of what we need to do is equip our practitioners with the confidence, the skills, the values to see that for fathers in general, I'll say this for fathers in general, that their choices and behaviors matter. That fathers' choices matter to child and family functioning. And that our work with entire families or communities has to include that, has to really keep that father or that male caregiver in view, and that we have to really skill up our workforce to feel safe meeting with perpetrators, to engaging them, to talking to them, to interviewing them, to documenting their attitudes, their own behavior. we need to have people who are skillful at saying to their staff, or do you feel safe? And what do we need to make you feel safe to meet with this person? Do we need to have you meet in the office with him so they can do that engagement? We have to have people who understand that when he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I feel so bad," that's not the same thing as behavior change. Or if he's sitting there crying, he may be crying because he got taught. We need to skill up the workforce so they can really know how to work with this population. Because unless we do that every time we hand somebody a mandate to keep kids safe in domestic violence, and we don't skill them up around perpetrators, they're going to feel like they need to go through the mom to get there. And until we do that, that's not going to change. So,
we have 1 minute left.
Yes, I know. So what I'm going to say is, and thanks, Wendy, for your comment there about this, about connecting perpetrators to the harm to kids. And we can talk more about behaviors in another setting. So my understanding, Lisa, is we're all going to leave here. And those of you coming to the next section will go out to the lobby, click on the button for the next session, and we will all be together again. And I will kind of pick up where I left off.